Hi everyone, thanks so much for being here this morning. My name is Dr. Romola Sanyal. I'm Associate Professor in Urban Geography in the Department of Geography and Environment. So what I'm going to be talking about today is some of the work that I've been doing over the last year as part of my British Academy Mid-Career Fellowship, which enables me to write a book, which is not titled The City as Refuge, but is on displacement. And so I'm going to be discussing some of that today, and hopefully we will have enough time for some interesting questions and things at the end. So I want to start by simply giving an overview of how I come to this sort of question. So for those of you who are familiar with geography as a discipline, you'd be familiar with some of these debates and discussions that have been taking place over at least the last decade, if not longer, around these questions of displacement. Now, I start with the contention that displacement shapes the world that we inhabit, from the processes of gentrification that we encounter in cities such as London, to the eviction of people and the destruction of their homes in informal settlements such as Delhi in India, to the violent upheaval of people due to conflicts in countries such as Syria and Myanmar. In each of these sites, the processes of displacement take on new shapes. They emerge out of unique configurations of politics, economics, cultural, and social issues. Now, to transpose concepts from one part of the world to another would be problematic. And we do see this in geography, for example. We have had these discussions about gentrification as being a concept that has moved from particularly the Euro-American context to other parts of the world. And we have seen scholars also pushing back against these concepts and talking about how we can't simply do that because the questions of land, ownership, occupation, so forth are quite different in other parts of the world. So to transpose equally these concepts of displacement, which very often, again, come out of this literature around gentrification and so forth, and move it to other parts of the world, such as the global south, can also be problematic. But equally, I would argue, to not see the connections between them that disproportionately affects the poor, the disenfranchised, and the marginalized, and that demands social justice, I would argue, also sanctions ignorance and worse, complicity. Now, as I said that in geography and sort of more interdisciplinary urban studies, there has been considerable attention given to different processes of displacement, outlining the ways in which they come about and the unequal effects that it has on different groups of people. So again, if we come back to the literature on gentrification, it has, for example, spent decades documenting and analyzing the changes to neighborhoods and cities as wealthier classes have pushed out those who are poorer. So in this image, for example, that I took in Athens, for those of you who might be familiar with Athens and have seen these pictures, this has been graffiti that's been put in different parts of certain neighborhoods, talking about the ways in which Airbnb has been raising rents in Athens and pushing out people who are unable to afford these apartments. There's been less focus, according to several scholars, on how places where people are displaced to are transformed. There's also been a wealth of work done on informal settlements in different parts of the world, the ways in which they are built, the lives of their inhabitants, and the processes and the effects of evictions and demolitions on them. This is an image that I took in one of the informal settlements in Calcutta, where I've grown up. And this is just one part of the settlement, and the other side of it has been, on the other side of this wall, the entire settlement had been evicted because this belongs to the railways. There's a more limited, though growing, analysis of conflict-based displacement on space and place, particularly in the global south. Now, there is, of course, the vast literature on refugee camps and detention centers. And there are many of us who have engaged with this particular kind of literature as well. This is the iconic image of Zaatari refugee camp in Jordan that many of you may be familiar with. This is one of the largest refugee camps in the world. But one of the things that many of us have been talking about has been to point to the fact that even though these kinds of images and these kinds of spaces symbolize displacement of a particular kind, particularly refugees, the majority of people who are displaced don't live in places like this. So even in Jordan, Zaatari might be iconic of Syrian refugees and displacement, but the majority of Syrians don't live in Zaatari. The majority of Syrians live in places like Amman. And there's been some exciting theorization of people living outside of camps through different conceptual lenses. And here too, we see the ways in which the lives of migrants and the urban poor come together as they inhabit precarious spaces in cities. Both are subject to continuous forms of violence and uncertainty. They are subject to evictions. They are subject to all kinds of state violence. Displacement for both have become woven into the fabric of their lives and the lives of the cities in which they inhabit. Solidarities are formed through the shared experiences of marginalization, but equally so are animosities as scarcities which are manufactured, I would argue, are an aid that recognizes some people and not all are impacted by displacement. So we see this sort of, we see housing crises, we see shelter crises, we see crises around employment and food and so forth. And many of these issues are also manufactured in many parts of the world. Equally, when we look at aid-related issues, it recognizes certain people as being legitimately displaced and others as not. And so it only reaches certain people and not others. So I build on these important foundations to carve out, hopefully, new ways of thinking about displacement, in which I take displacement as fundamental to the transformation of cities in the global south. So I ask, how does displacement as a concept and a process transform places through the presence and labor of those who are displaced, through the reception of those who receive the displaced, and through the aid and support of those seeking to support displacement? So what I'm arguing here is that displacement is an organizing logic of urbanization in the global south. So cities in the global south are made through the continuous processes of displacement, either through the displacement of people from their homes and settlements, and or through the movement of migrants displaced from elsewhere into them. And I'm using the term migrant very specifically because I don't agree with the distinction that is made between forced and economic migrants. Like with many other scholars who work in this area, we talk about how these are superficial boundaries that are created to separate out groups of people who have overlaps between them in important ways. So I take one thread of this, the displacement of migrants into cities, to draw attention to the ways in which they are not only victims of violence, but also the authors of urbanization in quite complex ways. So I'm not disagreeing, or I'm not trying to argue that they are not in fact subject to quite draconian forms of persecution, exploitation, and violence. But what I do also want to do is shift away from a violence-centered and a victim-centered approach to thinking about how they can also be seen as authors in the placemaking of cities. I draw on the critical work of the politics of recognition to highlight the ways in which certain strands of displacement that are recognized come to also reform the city through expert knowledge and through material aid. So it's not just displacement as a process in which people are moving in and out of places, but displacement as a concept that enables cities to be recreated in specific ways. So this is how I come to think of the city as a refuge. And I offer some insights into this through 4 case studies. Just to, again, highlight some of the images that I've used over here, this is one of the buildings that had previously been used to house Syrian refugees in Athens. The hotel has been demolished and been rebuilt into this particular site. And this is, again, this is an image from Beirut. This is from Sabra and Shatila, which is Shatila being a refugee camp and Sabra being the informal settlement around it. And this is sort of the market, this is one of the markets in the area. So I'm going to, as I said, illustrate some of this with some of the case studies. So the first intervention I wish to make is through looking at how refugees themselves become placemakers. So my first example comes from the work that I've done in India, particularly in the city of Calcutta, looking at the refugee colonies that had been created here in the aftermath of partition of the subcontinent in 1947. Now, the South Asia witnessed one of the largest mass migrations of people in the last century. So there are estimates between 10 to 15 million people who had been displaced as a result of the partition. And one of the arguments that scholars make is that partition remains unfinished business within the subcontinent as well. If you look at the eastern side of India, because the partition occurred on 2 sides, so the West Pakistan and East Pakistan. If you look on the eastern side, which is where Calcutta is located, it's the capital of the state of West Bengal, and it was one of the most important cities on this side of the country. If we look at the numbers of people who had been displaced on this side, on the eastern side, between 1946 and 62, which is sort of for historical reasons, we use that date range to talk about displacement because of partition. We are looking at about 4,261,257 people who were displaced on just the eastern border. If we look at specifically the dates around the partition between 1946, when the communal rioting began around in relation to the partition, to 1950, when there was the first sort of concerted efforts to try and stem the flow of people, we're looking at approximately 2.5 million people who were displaced across that border into India. Most of the people if you look at the state of West Bengal, which is what we're looking at, most of the people were displaced into 3 specific areas: the 24 Parganas, Calcutta, and Nadia. So these are the 3 areas that saw the largest numbers of people who came in, with Calcutta seeing about 433,000 people displaced into there. So we're looking at people who came by the thousands almost at certain points. And in about 1950, we see almost 1 million people who moved as a result of partition. And scholars have talked about the exponential growth of Calcutta and the 24 Parganas and Nadia as a result of the migration of people. Now, there's some important things to keep in mind in relation to looking at the colony areas. So these are the colony areas that I was studying, but effectively this is the Hooghly River, and we're looking at the city of Calcutta on this side of the river, but this entire belt were refugee colonies. So the entire suburban area and the area surrounding the city were squatted on by refugees. Now, one thing to keep in mind are the class and caste politics of people who came in. So a significant portion of the people who built these colonies came from middle-class backgrounds anyway. And that's something that's actually quite interesting. Middle-class people squatting becomes quite an interesting thing. And there are very important questions around land, property ownership, the recovery of middle-classness for them that becomes pivotal in trying to understand why they chose to occupy land in many of these areas. So there were some camps that were set up. There was also an effort to send people back from India back to East Pakistan because the government, the central government didn't think that the issue of violence was quite so significant within the eastern side of the border. But there was a lot of resistance to this, and middle-class refugees refused to go into the camps and instead occupied land that belonged to both the government as well as private landholders, and built these refugee colonies, squatter colonies, in these different areas of Calcutta. And they did a lot of this work themselves. So it was not just that they built their own houses. They also set up the infrastructure, the social, political, and physical infrastructures themselves, and the cultural infrastructures themselves. So there's a very important process of placemaking that occurs over here. So this is what the colonies look like today. So they look like middle-class areas of Calcutta. They're indistinguishable from other parts of the city. But you look at these narrow roads. These were all created first by the people who squatted in them. So they dug the ponds, they built the roads, they dug tube wells, they set up markets, they set up festivals, cultural festivals. They also engaged in all kinds of really important politics in the city, pushing back against property ownership and property rights, pushing back against the eviction bill that was intended to remove them from many of these colonies, and there were widespread protests and agitations that they had undertaken. And one of the things that happens also is that is not only that the government retracts from putting forward much of this legislation, and also eventually formalizes and regularizes many of these colonies, but also that it sets in motion particular kinds of political cultures in these colonies as well. And one of the things that's quite interesting that happens is that these continue to be marginalized areas, so they only get regularized over time, but one of the things is that they continue to be marginalized in many ways. And in the 1970s, what we see is that many of the refugee colonies also become hotbeds for the Naxalite movement in Bengal. And the Naxalite movement was the Maoist movement that took place in the 1970s. And the refugee areas were one of the important places in which this movement took hold, where a lot of the young men who grew up in these refugee colonies, who felt this sense of marginalization, as well also participated in many of these politics, right? So you can see that not only do you see a physical transformation of the city of Calcutta, but you also see a political transformation. You can see the ways in which refugees come to reshape the city, spatially, culturally, politically, socially, in quite profound ways. The second and third things that I want to talk about, moving on from kind of only focusing on refugees as being the involved in the transformation of cities, is to think about the ways in which they are received in cities. So again, I'm going to go through this quite quickly. One of the things that I've been looking at also is sort of engaging in these comparisons with different parts of the world. So there's been some really interesting work that's emerged out of Lebanon and Greece as well. So some of the work that I've been doing in Greece, in Lebanon, I'll start with Lebanon, is looking at how NGOs have been involved in supporting Syrians in urban areas. Now, because of the history of Palestinians particularly, but also others, Lebanon does not have a camp policy. So you do not have refugee camps in Lebanon as you do in Jordan. And so as a result of that, what you have is a privatized response to the Syrian crisis. So people either live in informal settlements, or they live in privately rented apartments or other privately rented places in Lebanon. Now, how do you support people, such a large number of people? So again, for those of you who may not be familiar, there's about 1.5 to 2 million people Syrians who are displaced into Lebanon, conservatively speaking, in a country of about 6 million. So Lebanon has the highest per capita refugees in the world. So how do you support this many people in a place where you can't locate them? And also where Lebanon has faced a political crisis, an economic crisis, and where people have been extremely welcoming. The Lebanese have been extremely welcoming to the Syrians, but also where they are faced with their own scarcities and where they are faced with their own vulnerabilities, how do you then extend hospitality to people over a long period of time, right? It's been 11 years since the Syrian crisis. And so what you see is NGOs who first started by giving emergency aid and providing, winterization kits and so on and so forth, after a couple of years realizing that they're antagonizing the local communities because they're not supporting local communities, they're only targeting Syrians. And in order to actually work in a more viable way in Lebanon, they would have to change the ways in which they provide aid. So how do you do that? So one of the examples that I talk about in some of my other work is looking at the neighborhood approach or the area-based approaches that have been done in other parts of the world, but this is one of the things that they do in Lebanon as well. So in CARE, which works closely with a Lebanese NGO called Akaruna, they've been working in the northern city of Tripoli, where they engage in a neighborhood upgrading approach, in which what they do is that they will do they will identify neighborhoods and where there are high numbers of Syrian refugees, and they will come in and they will do very specific kinds of upgrading work. So they'll upgrade street lighting, they'll put in benches, they'll improve the park, they might put in a tube well, they'll improve some of the housing. So they will do specific things that they feel will support both the host community but also the refugees, so that they can address both vulnerabilities rather than targeting only one group. In Thessaloniki, which is, so I'm moving to the Greek context. Now, again, in Greece, there's been about over 100,000 people who have come in as refugees into Greece, and Greece is primarily seen as a transit country, in that many refugees simply move through Greece. They come in, they might get the refugee documents, and then they move on to other countries in Europe. In Greece, there's been a lot of focus on the islands as well, and looking at the camps in many of the islands. But again, I've been trying to do some work in the urban areas. And in cities such as Thessaloniki, one of the things that we see is, again, a lot of NGOs that have been involved in providing housing for asylum seekers who are living in urban areas. Now, there are very specific vulnerability criteria that you have to meet in order to be moved from the islands into the mainland, particularly cities in Greece. And NGOs will support families with wraparound services, so they will provide them with accommodation, and then they will provide them with legal assistance, psychosocial assistance, education, so on and so forth. Now, what's been really interesting about this is that, and I'm sure many of you may have heard about these programs. So we had the SDA program that had been running for several years, that has now been phased out as of the end of last year. We have the Helios program. The SDA program had been funded by DG ECHO, and it was run by UNHCR. Helios is run by IOM and is funded through the Greek government itself. And they're quite different programs, because the Helios program is for people who've already been given refugee status, and they're supposed to find it's supposed to be temporary accommodation before they move on. What has happened, I don't want to get into the specifics of the programs, but one of the things that's been quite interesting is specifically looking at the case of the Major Development Agency in Thessaloniki, which has been one of the partners in both the SDA program and the Helios program, has been that they've taken some of what they have learned in providing accommodation for asylum seekers to pilot an affordable housing program. Now, affordable housing is something that's quite an issue in Greece as well. And so what the local government is now trying to do is trying to take what they did with the asylum seeker program, which is to reach out to specific landlords, bring certain apartments up to a particular standard, and be able to rent them out at a certain level as an affordable housing program, which is now being picked up by the Greek government. So we can see then that the reception of people also becomes an important way in which displacement reconfigures urban areas. That NGOs, both local and international NGOs, will draw on aid to then transform neighborhoods, as we can see in the Lebanese case, that they will try and transform neighborhoods, and that will make quite significant changes to particular places. And then you can see that it also then percolates into some of the more long-term policies for local governments in certain countries. And then finally, I want to touch very briefly on looking at how then the question of displacement and urbanization reconfigures humanitarian aid. So one of the things that I have been trying to do a bit more is to look at how humanitarian aid is beginning to undertake an urban turn. So how are different NGOs, funding agencies, donors, multilateral organizations, how are they engaging with this question around urban crises? And again, what we're seeing very, very slowly is a gradual shift towards thinking about the urban agenda and thinking about how to support people in urban areas. So we have things like the Global Alliance for Urban Crises. And then we also have the more robust discussions around durable solutions. So again, there are three kinds of durable solutions. You can get resettled in another country, you can have a voluntary repatriation, or you can have local integration. And with the local integration, one of the things that that many organizations are looking at is also what does that mean in real terms. So what does that mean in terms of how interventions should be taking place, and you know that and recognizing that there's now a nexus between humanitarian crises and development, and how to intervene knowing that it's not just about short-term crises anymore, but taking on a more developmental lens. So in sum then, what we come to see is that displacement is not only a process by which people are unhomed, but is fundamental to how cities continually transform in the global south. It's not just a process that affects those who are displaced and the communities they are displaced into, but also becomes the organizing logic of humanitarian aid and urbanization. So ultimately then, displacement is as much about the unmaking of places as it is about the remaking of others. Now then,